Hello, and welcome to this very important conversation about caring, dying, and grieving. My name's DARMODY, and as part of Carers Week, I have an amazing panel of guests with me. Over the next 45 minutes or so, they are going to help us learn more about grief and how it impacts on us, especially when we care for a loved one. We will hear their personal experiences, the latest research, and look at ways to look after ourselves and others while caring and after the caring stops. You're going to hear how important it is to have ongoing support and information. And today's discussion is sponsored by CarerHelp. It's a new website for carers looking after someone at the end of life. And you'll hear more about that fantastic new resource a little later in our conversation. But let me introduce our panellists. Chris Hall. Chris is CEO of the Australian Centre for Grief and Bereavement and is also a psychologist. Bryony Lyle. Bryony cared for her husband Jared through multiple cancer diagnosis and palliative care. Lauren Breen. Lauren is an associate professor at Curtin University and has written numerous papers on grief and carers. VOULA KALLIANIS is a social worker within palliative care at St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne. She's worked for over a decade with families who are caring for someone at the end of life. And Rennie Nisi O'Connell. Rennie's a funeral director with 25 years of experience who is passionate about helping people through the death of a loved one. Hello to you all and thanks for being with us. Bryony, I'd like to start with you, if I can. You had an amazing journey with your husband, Jared, from high school in Shepparton to the world's sporting stage. You were by Jared's side for all the highs and lows of his international golfing career, multiple cancer diagnosis, treatment, palliative care, and then his death in August 2018. What do you remember about caring for Jared in the final weeks of his life?
My memories are really of stress, being really busy. Everything felt really overwhelming. And the burden, I think that's the right word, the burden of the responsibility of caring for somebody that you know is nearing the end of life.
Knowing that Jared was going to die and making that palliative care decision together to spend his last days at home, do you think you experienced any grief before Jared actually died?
I think I was probably just too caught up in everything that was going on and all of the things that needed to be done to actually allow myself the time to stop and really think about the magnitude of what we were talking about and dealing with and facing. I had a moment when the first time we had a discussion with his physicians and the medical team, when they really for the first time introduced the idea of palliative care, and basically them saying, okay, that's your decision now, and you know we're ready to hand you over to the pal care team. And I think to hear them say it for the first time, even though we knew it was coming, was probably a time when it was a real shock to me to hear that. But I don't think I experienced grief in the lead up to his death.
What about after Jared died? What was your experience, your memory of grieving for him then?
My immediate response immediately when he died was relief, which I felt really guilty about for quite a long time. And so relief, but also a need to get away from him. I knew he wasn't there anymore, but I just had to, I couldn't stay. I didn't want to see him. I didn't really want to know what was going to be happening with his body or anything afterwards. I just needed to leave, and I did. Fortunately, there were other people there, but I was able to leave. But relief was the main emotion that I felt immediately, and then very quickly turned to the thought that I then had to tell my children that it had actually happened. So it was just preparing myself for that conversation, which obviously wasn't easy. And then I was busy. I was busy preparing again for a private service, and then after that for a public service that we had. So I just kept myself really, really busy, and I don't think I actually grieved properly, if there is such a thing, probably for several weeks, if not months, after he died.
Chris, you've heard Bryony's personal experience there of the immediate feeling of grief after Jared died, and then her reflection that it might be weeks and months afterwards. Do we all experience grief differently?
I mean, we all love differently and we all grieve differently. We've moved away from this cookie-cutter approach that people go through grief in the same kind of way. It's very personal, it's very individual, and people will grieve different things at different times. So there may be a number of losses or changes or adjustments during the period of illness that in a real sense culminates with the bereavement, the death of the person that we love. And then of course there are other grief experiences and losses that follow shortly thereafter.
Can you tell us exactly what grief is?
Well, at its most simplest, grief is our response to loss, and that may be the loss of a relationship. We often refer to the idea of bereavement when we're experiencing the death of someone. But these losses can be of people, places, even ideas. Often people during their illness will experience a loss of sense of safety or predictability in their life. And so grief has also been described as the way we love somebody after they die. The grief is, in a sense, the price we pay for love. It's unavoidable, it's universal, but in fact the way we might express that grief varies tremendously from person to person.
So then, are there any ways that we can prepare for grief?
Well, we know that information is really helpful. So even during that period of illness, of engaging families in conversations, often what people want to do desperately is to have conversations, but often don't know how to start those or how to respond. So I think we need to be, in a sense, courageous. We need to have difficult conversations. We need to support people as they go to often the most difficult part of their experience. Resources that provide information, the support of family and friends. The experience, unfortunately, of many grieving and bereaved people is not one of enhanced social support, but one of isolation. That people don't know what to say or how to respond, and that anxiety really prevents them from connecting and supporting the person in need.
VOULA, you've worked as a social worker in palliative care for many years. In your experience, what can help carers prepare for the loss of a loved one?
Right. From the beginning, I guess, for carers to have a knowledge and understanding of the actual illness and disease, knowing what to expect in terms of any physical symptoms, whether they'll change cognitively and behaviourally, to look out for those symptoms. Whether it's a long-term or short-term prognosis, gives the idea of what to take stock in terms of will it affect their finances, how to prepare the children, in terms of work, do they take time off work, and also a sense of what kind of supports they require, whether it's, as I said, short-term or long-term, and sometimes they don't know. It could be for many, many years or many, many months. The resources are very important for carers in terms of accessing supports, resources, finances, and other carers that have gone through this, because for many people it's a sense that they're on their own in this very, very difficult time. Sometimes even assisting the patient or the person they're caring for to do things like biographies or writing music or cards down the track may help quite a bit. The legal arena is important. For example, drawing up a will or looking at financial power of attorney, or nominating a medical treatment decision maker, or doing advanced care directives. It ensures the person's wishes are honoured, and it gives the carer a sense of relief and a sense of direction as to what they will do. When it's closer to the dying, I guess knowledge of the physical signs of dying is very important for some of the carers to be around, perhaps to even help in the caring, in the if not feeding, to put moisture around the mouth if it's a dry mouth, or calling for a priest if there's some religious needs at that time, and also some rituals. But we have all these discussions with carers to make sure if this is important to them, that we will try and assist them with it.
And what about after the death of their loved one? How important is it that carers are well supported after that? And is there anything that they can do, I guess, to prepare for that?
One of the big losses is not only losing their loved one, also the healthcare team that they have known maybe for months or years or weeks. They will feel abandoned because they will no longer be there. So we need to ensure they have good support systems, whether it's their family, friends, to help with funeral arrangements. It's to ensure that they have information. They may not use it at that time, but as long as they have information that they can access, when they're ready, they will be ready to access that. So it's quite important, yeah.
Bryony, are you able to let us know a bit about the support that you had after Jared died?
I was busy nodding along to some of the things that VOULA was saying about the feeling of, being abandoned by the medical team, because that's who you relied on all that time. And also of feeling like you are alone and that, there's nobody else that would understand or going through it. And I actually found that a lot of people around me actually disappeared very soon after Jared actually died. They were there, offering to help the whole time that he was unwell. And then once he actually died, they all headed home, or, just kind of closed in on themselves. And I guess they were all having to deal with the grief and the experience as well. But I did feel very alone in the weeks immediately after he had died. And I couldn't understand why. I would have thought people knew that was the time more than ever, really, that the girls and myself needed the support. Yeah, I don't know why, whether people didn't know what to say or what to do. It was a really tricky time, those few weeks.
Chris, is that something that is quite common, what Bryony is talking about there, that maybe people disappear because they think that's the right thing to do?
Absolutely. And I think people still see grief a bit like, the cold or the flu. You have this kind of short period of time where life's unsettled and then life returns quickly back to normal. And that's just not the way grief plays out in people's lives. My firm view is that most of the problems that grieving people have are social problems. It's the inability or the unwillingness of people to actually connect with them, to be present. And I really think as a culture, we still have a lot of work to do to say that these things we can speak of. And we know that the strongest protective factor for grieving and bereaved people is social support, being surrounded by people that love and care for us. And again, we may do this without the perfect words. We may simply do it through a gesture, but I think it's really important that we kind of reach out to people and really convey and communicate to us that, grief is not just, an event. It's a process that continues in many ways for our entire lifetime, but well beyond that immediate period after the death.
Bryony, what about things that were helpful from others or helpful at the time that Jared died in relation to your grief? Was the funeral something that was an important element for you and your girls?
Yes, we had decided because of the public nature, I suppose, of Jared's life and death. We had fortunately decided that as soon as possible after he died that we would have a private funeral service, and more than anything that was for the girls, because for us the process had been so long and so confusing for the girls, and their level of understanding was varied with their age differences, but for other people, it seemed really sudden, but for us, and for myself, it had been such a long process, and we needed the funeral to say our goodbyes and to put some kind of end to it, I think. I don't really know how to describe it, but just kind of to have that moment of, it's over and that process has ended. But we then went about having the public memorial service. But what it meant by having the private one was that the public one for the girls and I felt far easier, if you like, because our funeral had already taken place. And the second one, I'm sure the girls really had no idea why it was happening again. But I'm really glad that we did that. And decided that we would do something privately for us, and then take into account what we would do for other people, I guess.
Rennie, obviously Bryony's experience is quite unique given the high profile of Jared and their family and what he had been going through, but what role does a funeral play for someone, and especially I guess that private moment that Bryony and her daughters were able to have, is that what everybody is really looking for?
I think the funeral has a really fundamental role to play in the grief process, and I think it's probably only secondary to the actual treatment, medical or otherwise, of the person in their dying process. So I think a funeral is a really important opportunity to honour the life of the person who's died. It's a really important opportunity to tell the story of their life. A lot of families find it really, really important to create an event that marks this event that's happened in their lives. So it's incredibly important. And I really love the fact that Bryony had the courage to say, this is what's right for us. We need this private farewell now, and later we'll have something public for everybody else to join in. And I think that's really good that she was able to say, this is what matters to us, this is what's important. I think funerals also are an opportunity to tell the world how important this person was in the lives of those that they leave behind. It's really important that a person's name is not forgotten, that they're still mentioned. So all of these things happen within the funeral process. And I think it's really important to have the opportunity to say those final goodbyes, to lay the body to rest, usually by burial or cremation. And it's really important within the funeral process that we have a time where we separate, the living separate from the dead. It's a really significant process, and I often like to term it as being a sacred moment where we have those words of committal where maybe they're laying a flower on or coming to say that goodbye, or just pausing with the coffin to touch it, to have their last physical moments with that person. The need to know what's actually happened to the body of a person is incredibly important. So all of those things, yes, I think the funeral plays a huge role in the grief process.
Can you tell us a bit about how you prepare carers for the funeral?
Firstly, with lots of support, lots and lots of support. For us as funeral directors, we need to be really well prepared ahead of time so that on the day we are very present for the family or for the carers, the people that were looking after the person. With interactions with the carers that are gentle, that take their time. Sometimes we may need to make 2 or 3 visits to that family or have 2 or 3 consultations because it's just not possible for them to have made all the choices that we're asking of them in one hour session. So my policy or our policy is that however long it takes is however long it takes. Active listening. What are they really saying? And listen to what's not being said as well as to what is being said. Sometimes people are not very forthcoming and you think there's a hidden story in here. What do I need to uncover so that this funeral actively meets the needs of every person that was represented here? I love to say things like, tell me about Joe, tell me about how special to you he was. So I make it personal with them so that they know that I'm not just interested in them, but that I wish I'd known him because he is the most important thing in their life right now. Lots of choices in decision making. Funeral directors that don't have an agenda when they walk into a room. We want to leave what we think should be happening out the door and we want to listen to what the family are telling us that they need from us. Reassuring the carers that we will be there on the day and that they will get through it. Making positive affirmations of the funeral they've planned so that it fits for this person. If you're conducting the funeral for a biker, it's going to be very different to an elderly lady who was in a nursing home, and it should be, it must be. Trying to plant the idea with the carers that they're going to have some very big empty spaces once the funeral process is over. It takes up huge resources of our time, emotions, mentally, physically, and when that person dies, the emptiness is overwhelming. So for carers, we have to build a life. I too cared for my husband who was terminally ill. Building a life that you didn't want and you didn't ask for, nevertheless it has to be done. So they're, for me, some of the clues in preparing carers as they face coming to the funeral of someone they love.
I'd like to bring in Associate Professor Lauren Breen here to provide a research perspective for us. Lauren, you've been involved in a study of carers through the palliative care experience. Could you please share with us what you've discovered from your research?
Yeah, I led a study of carers caring for someone in palliative care, and we surveyed them 4 times, once when they were caring and 4 times after the person had died. And we also had a comparison group of people who weren't carers. And what we found was that it took about 10 months for people, for their general health and quality of life to return back to what we might consider to be normal. And this might not be surprising to many of us today, but probably surprising for people who think that grief is something that is just a very short-term phenomenon.
Are you able to know when carers are most distressed through the work you've done?
Yeah, in the study I just described, carers' quality of life and general health were lowest while they were caring. And interestingly, their grief while they were caring was also the same as 3 to 4 months after the death.
How does being a carer impact on the grief experience?
In lots of different ways. There's so much practical hands-on care. It can be really overwhelming in terms of what people actually have to do while they're caring. And they can be so busy with the caring that they don't have the time and energy to focus on themselves and their needs, which can make it obviously a lot more tricky. And so then it makes it hard that you don't have the psychological resources to even consider your own grief or to be able to manage that.
Are you able to give us any insight, I guess, into how we as a community can be more compassionate and support bereaved carers?
Yeah, so if carers stopped caring tomorrow, it would cost our economy just billions of dollars. So we need to do a lot more to look after carers. Family and friends are the most common source of support in grief, but about a third of bereaved people say that they don't get enough support from their family and friends, or they don't get the type of support that they would have liked. So it'd be helpful to know how to harness that kind of support that's available to them. And we often say to people who are grieving, oh, let me know if you need anything. But that puts the onus on the person who is grieving to recognise that they have a need and to feel comfortable to ask for it. So maybe it's better to have a think about actually making an offer. I'll drop a lasagna over tomorrow night, or would it be helpful if I get the kids from school for you on Thursday? Things like that.
More practical, which makes sense. What are some of the factors that impact on how a carer experiences grief?
Yeah, there are two main factors, I guess, that affect how we grieve. So one is around the circumstances of the death, and the other is about who we are as a person and what we bring to the grief. So in general, deaths that are sudden or violent or preventable or of someone young can be harder to deal with. And when it comes to the person who is grieving, if they've previously experienced traumatic events or have several losses close together or don't have much social support, they're also likely to find grief to be harder to manage.
How important is it, do you think, that we continue to understand more about grief and how it impacts the different people in our community?
Yeah, there's still a lot that we don't know. A lot of the early studies are based on women grieving the deaths of their husbands. So there's a lot that we don't know in terms of some other groups. So we don't know so much about how children grieve, for example, or grief in culturally and linguistically diverse communities, First Nations communities, grief from non-death losses, for example, or how we can better support people in particular settings like schools or workplaces and the broader community.
VOULA, I'm interested if you could maybe give us some insight into what services are available for carers who are grieving in addition to palliative care.
Look, first of all, I would think the informal supports, family and friends, is always important because social connection is critical for people not to feel abandoned, not to feel so alone and lonely. Then there are other supports such as Carer Gateway, CarerHelp, Carers Victoria, at which they offer not only practical supports, but I guess ways to look after yourself. The self-care is very important, as people alluded to before, Rennie and Lauren, and it's the self-care does go out of the window a lot of the times, and it's just building up the self-esteem. Again, that your new sense of self in the world, which will take a bit of time. And I guess not to make very big decisions at this time because most people are quite vulnerable. And as carers, they've got other commitments that often, carers have children or they have jobs or work colleagues that they need to look after as well in terms of building up their own personal care and strength. So it takes a bit of time. It takes quite a bit of time, yeah.
Bryony, I know that you were referred to a service, an organisation about 12 months after Jared died, and that was helpful for you and your girls. Can you tell us about the services that were good for you?
Yes, we were referred to an organisation called Wombat's Wish, who provide care for children who are grieving. And the way that they do it primarily is by running a weekend-long camp that the partner, the spouse goes to with the children, and the parents and the children are separated and do different activities. And I went, it was about 12 months after Jared died. I went with my eldest daughter, who she must have been 7 at the time, I think. And that was one of the best things that we did. The timing of it was great. To be separated from her for that experience, I was a bit nervous about it, but it turned out to also be a really great thing. The way they went about it, there was almost a 1-to-1 ratio of the volunteers and trained child psychologists and bereavement counsellors working with the children. But they created an environment for the adults and the children where you were encouraged to share your story. You were supported by people around you who obviously their experiences were very different to your own, but people weren't looking at you or talking about you or avoiding you or not knowing what to say, because we were all in the same boat, I guess. And they also created some really amazing experiences for the children, where they were involved in, a special candle lighting ceremony where they could talk about who they'd lost and who they were remembering, and they were allowed to cry about it, and they were allowed to be upset, and there wasn't a time limit on it. There wasn't okay, let's move on to the next activity now. It was, you take your time, and you let them be led by their emotions, I guess. And that was something that my daughter hadn't experienced. And she'd almost had almost the opposite, in a way, with the school that she's at, and potentially school systems in general, just not knowing how to support kids. And heaven forbid they should talk about somebody dying at school. So she had been, taken away from her friends and classroom if she ever felt the need to talk. It was, she was made to feel like that's not the thing to do. So to actually be in a place that was created by Wombat's Wish, of where she could, quite openly share what she needed to share or not share, was a really great thing. And both of us had amazing experiences.
Bryony, I'm not sure if you can see, but all our panellists have been nodding all the way through what you were just talking about then. Chris, why is it that what Bryony was talking about there, why did that particularly work for her and her daughter? What were the elements there that maybe we could take away and use for our own grief or to help others?
Well, I think the first thing to recognise is if we're old enough to love, we're old enough to grieve, and that really the needs of children we really need to be very mindful of. And it's great that organisations like Wombat's Wish really are available to create a safe place for grieving people. And I think that for me is one of the core features here, that people have different safe places for engaging with their experiences of loss. And we often want to do that in relationships that we already have, that are pre-existing. So I think to be with people who, in a sense, get us. I love the old Yiddish expression that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them in those proportions. It's really about our capacity to listen. Grief is not something that's fixable in a conventional sense. The way we can be most supportive is simply to be present and to kind of create a space where people are allowed to tell their story. And often grieving people need to be able to tell their story over and over again. That's not about stuckness. With each retelling, the grieving person finds a new or a different place to hold that relationship. And again, the other comment I'd make is that grief isn't about saying goodbye or letting go. Death ends a life, it doesn't end a relationship. And so this has been a fundamental change in the way we think about grief. It's not about people getting over it. It's about how do we move from a relationship where that person is physically present to a relationship of memory that we carry forward, and which for us, and also certainly for children, changes as we change over time.
VOULA, are there any myths around grief that you would like to debunk?
Yes, there are quite a few. I think most people think that grief starts as soon as the person dies. But for many, it actually starts at the diagnosis stage, where people do imagine that they're going to lose this person, and what that means, their relationship, their place in this family, their place in the world. It'll impact on their finances perhaps, and looking at what's going to happen with the children and the budgeting and their own work. Do they stop work? So it actually starts, and also missing, future things, anniversaries or birthdays, and then the milestones, the baby they're not going to see, or the grandchild that's not going to happen. As people said before, there is no specific way to grieve, and there's no timeline, and there's no right or wrong. And everyone, people say cultural groups. Look, I'm of a Greek background, and I've seen many families that are Greek, and they're all very different, and they all express their grief differently and want things done differently. So the key is to ask the person or the family what is important to them. Often I hear when the loved ones come into our palliative care unit, and when we see the carer, whether they're wife or brother or whatever, they seem to say, I'm only the carer, only the wife. We make a point of saying, listen, you have done quite a lot. In terms of being in our palliative care unit, we have, nurses that are working, they're on shifts, we have help. And for many carers, they've done this all on their own and coordinated with services. And being a carer, they have other commitments. They have, they may be caring for other family members. They are working. They may have children. They have so many different identities, and their world sometimes gets very small. And hence their own self, they doubt their own self. So we need to build them up and saying, you're doing a lot more, and you are a lot more than what you say. Another myth is that carers are females. Predominantly, they are mostly females, but there are also males. There's sons, husbands, fathers that are also carers. There's an assumption that carers are healthy, but some carers are very frail. I've seen family members in their 80s and 90s looking after their loved ones. And on the other spectrum, I see 30s and 40s looking after their loved ones. And even younger, and young people going to school and studying. So caring, it's got there's a whole spectrum. The other assumption is that a carer has the ability to do so much. They've got their time on their hands, but as I said, they've got all these other commitments, and it has implications for their own health, their own finances, and I guess their own psychological well-being. The carer has got quite a lot of roles, and it's a huge role. And as people alluded to before, the carer also requires a lot of care and acknowledgement.
Absolutely. Lauren, what about from your perspective? Are there any myths around grief that you would like to clear up?
Yeah, I think just adding on to that only women grieve, that children, men, people with intellectual disability or older adults don't grieve. Grief only takes a few days or a few months. If you just have a good cry, you'll get over it. That it's just an emotion, that it goes in stages. You just need to focus on the positives, and then it'll all be okay. So many of those kinds of things that people hear all the time that are not particularly helpful and can potentially be quite harmful as well.
And Rennie, in your experience, is there anything about grief you want to clear up?
Look, I think there are two that really stand out for me, and one is where people say, oh, time heals, and I like to qualify that by saying time well spent heals. Time spent pursuing wholeness and recovery can heal, but time on its own doesn't just heal. And the other one is, if we just get the funeral over, the pain will stop. And so people often want to rush the funeral, have it in just a few days, where and they think that once that's over, then they can go back to life as normal, and they're very, very surprised when nothing is normal anymore. So they're the two main ones that I would come across.
Chris, how do you know if you're not coping with your grief and you actually need to see a health professional?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that most people respond to these experiences of loss with great resiliency, and that most people neither need nor do they particularly benefit from kind of grief therapy. But there is certainly a small proportion of people, perhaps around 10% in the general population, where this normal sort of adjustment to grief is somehow derailed by something. It might be concerning the death, but there might be some issue that really challenges them in their grief. Often people will recognise this themselves. They'll say things like, it's been 6 months, it's been 12 months, it feels as raw and fresh as it ever was. They find it very difficult to sleep. We know that sleeping difficulties is a very strong predictor of poor outcome in bereavement. Or it might be that just dealing with the challenges of daily life become too difficult. And really it's at this point where we would encourage people to seek support. Now, it's important when we think about support's much more than grief counselling. There are lots of ways of seeking support. This might be through reading the stories of others, or connecting with other people, or being perhaps more engaged with social groups and social meetings. Or it might be a support group. Many bereaved people want to be with other people who've had a similar experience, and so that's really important. Or it may be a case of seeing a bereavement counsellor. And in a sense, that's often about dealing with the most difficult aspects of that experience, that thing that really remains a real challenge. Or it might be that people are really struggling with just trying to make sense of this whole experience that they've been through.
Bryony, what advice would you give other carers who are at the end of their caring journey?
Oh, that's like the $1 million question, isn't it? I think you just have to ask for help. I think, although it's easy to say that, but when you're actually in it, you don't know what you need or what you don't need. It's just a case of, I kind of think of it now as it's just survival mode. You just, it's one foot in front of the other, whatever crops up in front of you, solve it, deal with it, move on to the next one. You just don't always have a chance to sit back and see the experience for what it is and realise, what help you do need, or, what you are struggling with sometimes. But I think it is, once you can identify who's there to help you and who, can actually do something to benefit you, then to really just put your hand up and say, yes, I need help, or, I just need to talk to somebody, or... I think that's, and the other part of it would be knowledge. It's just the importance of knowledge and really understanding what you're dealing with, what the process will be, even what's available to you, what are the sorts of decisions you're going to be faced with. I'm one of those people that will read, someone will give me a handout, I will read it and I will get back to you with my list of questions if I don't understand it. And it became a bit of a running joke with Jared and his doctors that they would see him for 5 minutes and then see me for 20 minutes to follow up all of my questions. But that's what I needed. If, you are literally dealing with life and death. And if there is any confusion over any part of it, or anything that you've been told, or anything that's happening, if you don't understand it, don't take no for an answer. You have to know what you're dealing with. It's just that there's no other way around it. You don't want to be left with any what ifs or any confusion or anything that's unclear, especially when you get to the end, and knowing what's about to come and being able to be prepared for it. In a way, it doesn't necessarily make it easier, but at least it's, I don't know, you just know what to expect maybe.
And Chris, Bryony has mentioned their, information, resources, ongoing support, and CarerHelp is a new website that offers that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what people can gain by using it?
Sure, I'm a huge fan of the CarerHelp website. It really is I think, a successful attempt to bring together the best resources, the best material, the best information for carers, and it really supports them through their journey from the point of sort of diagnosis of a friend or family member right through to the death and into the bereavement phase. It's been written by kind of experts in the field. It's good evidence-based material. And one of the great things is it's available 24/7, so people can go to carerhelp.com.au, they can dip into it, they can hear the stories of other carers, they can hear the stories of people who've kind of, had a similar experience, and it's something that people can dip in and out of. You don't have to digest the entire website in one sitting, but I think knowledge is power, and giving people access to really some high quality information through CarerHelp is a huge resource that people can avail themselves of.
Thanks very much, Chris. It's great to know that there's that amazing resource, carerhelp.com.au, that we can go to at any time now or into the future. But if you are watching at the moment and you're feeling as though you would need some immediate help, the best place to go is your GP, or you can call Lifeline on 131114. It's been a fantastic conversation today. We've obviously just touched on things, but I hope it's been helpful for you. A very big thank you to our panel today, to Chris Hall, to Bryony Lyle, to VOULA KALLIANIS, to Lauren Breen and Rennie Nisi O'Connell. I really appreciate your insight and your personal experiences. It's been fantastic. And a big thank you to Carers Australia for supporting this event today as part of Carers Week 2020, and also to the Centre for Palliative Care for putting together today's panel. We really appreciate the discussion, and I hope you've got a lot out of it. Thank you.